Hockey Canada has named its preliminary roster for the 2025 World Juniors, featuring 7 returnees from last year's squad, as well as a handful of top prospects for the upcoming 2 NHL drafts. With selection camp taking place this week at TD Place in Ottawa, today I'm joined by Director of Scouting Brock Otten to get his initial thoughts on the group and put together the lineup he would ice at the tournament. The first question I do just really want to ask you is, how's the scouting season going so far?
It's going well. It's been a little bit different. For those who don't know me as well, just became a first-time dad, so trying to balance that and scouting has been a challenge because previous to that, I could just go to any game that I ever wanted to go to, cover any event that I wanted to go to, and now that I have other responsibilities, it's been a little bit more of a challenge. A little bit more video than maybe I normally rely on at this point of the year. But such is life, and that's the great thing about the way that scouting is these days. Is there's so many different things that are available to us as scouts that make our job a little bit easier. So yeah, different, but still good.
As fun as it is when you have like a Connor Bedard where you just kind of know who's going to go first overall all year, I think it's shaping up to be a really fun class. Those 3 OHL guys really giving Higgins a run for their money.
Yeah, it's a really fun year to cover Ontario. I do think we're starting to see a sort of separation of those top four. I think the 3 OHL guys, as you mentioned, and then James Higgins. And I think, honestly, it could go in any of the four being first overall potential candidates. I really do think when we get closer to June, that's going to be the case. I think that you could make a case for any four of them. I think right now Misa probably is the lowest case. He has the least hype as a first overall candidate. But the way that he's playing, if he continues to play that way and has a strong playoff for Saginaw, eventually he's going to be tough to keep out of that conversation. And I do think we're starting to see the gap widen with those four from the rest of the group. And the fact that three of those players play in Ontario is fantastic for me.
So taking a look at the Team Canada camp roster, I think at this point, most of the discussion is more around omissions rather than inclusions. So let's just get that out of the way. Who do you think stands out as the biggest exclusion from this roster?
The biggest one that was shocking for me was Carter Yakemchuk. I just think there's so many different things that I'm confused about, and the first being he's a right shot defender. And I look at this roster and I look at some of the guys available on the right side, and I think it's less inspiring than those available on the left side. And you've got a big right shot defender who started well, played well in some NHL preseason games and looked like he was even a potential candidate to start and play most of the year with Ottawa. Even like it's crazy to me that somebody who's a high end prospect, a late '05, so this is his last kick at the can, right? This isn't an '06. Carter Yakemchuk is a late '05. So he's older, he's got experience, he's got the talent, he's got the pedigree. He can play in any situation. I'm just kind of shocked that he wasn't somebody they wanted to look at on the right side. So that was the big one for me. There's always going to be so many talking points when it comes to snubs for Team Canada because the roster is so deep, the talent pool is so deep, right? But that was a big one for me, given his size and ability to play in all situations on the right side.
Obviously, there are defensemen at this camp that are capable in that power play anchor role, but to me, I think they had in Yakubchuk and Parekh, kind of an abundance of riches where I was confused again that they didn't, at least take them on as that seventh man and, they're see how the power play works and see if they do need a guy more like that, like the Quinn Hughes or Kale McCarr, for example.
Yeah, and I think Parekh is another one worth talking about. When you look at this roster and the players available, I think you look at a lot of really good defenders and a lot of really good two-way defenders, and you look at some even really good offensive defenders. But even guys like Sam Dickinson, like Oliver Bonk, like Tanner Molendyk, even Matthew Schaefer, you could throw into that mix, right? Um, would you call any of them really true power play catalysts, playmakers, quarterbacks? I would consider a lot of them more of like the power play triggermen type, right? The guys who have the big shot from the point. who are quality skaters who can move the puck, but they're not that sort of Cale Makar type. At least not yet. Like Matthew Schaefer, I think can get there, but not yet at the U20 level. Um, so it is a little bit shocking they didn't want to bring him in to take a look at to see how he could quarterback a power play with some of these big guns, even if you're sheltering his minutes, right? Like if he's your seventh defender, and he really only sees the ice in power play time or sheltered offensive zone starts at even strength. I was again a little bit shocked that they didn't want to get a look to see what his dynamic offensive abilities could bring to the table.
Another big name omitted from the list was, of course, Beckett Sennecke. I think I saw a stat. It's the first time in a long time, anyway, that a third overall pick has not made the Team Canada camp the following year.
Yeah, there's another one, right? Like when you look at this roster, there's not a lot of size in the forward group, right? Like it's a pretty small forward group, and Seneca is the type that could play in any situation. Um, Hockey Canada always puts together sort of a high end checking line, shutdown line, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think that he could have been a guy that would have been a great candidate for that kind of role, given the size, the physicality, the skill, the two-way sense. Um, so yeah, he was another one that, given that he's playing really well, we're not talking about somebody who's struggling at the OHL level. We're talking about somebody who just put up what was it, 6 points against
Yeah.
Dave Cameron and the 67s the other night, right? I don't know if that was a bit of a statement to Mr. Cameron or not, but again, another guy that could play in a variety of different roles that brings something to the camp that they don't have a lot of. Uh, and I mean, maybe that speaks to the kind of identity that Hockey Canada and their scouts want to form with this year's group. I think it definitely does. I think this is what they're saying they want to play like. They're emphasizing skill over size and power, which is a bit of a U-turn for Hockey Canada. It's definitely not something that we're used to. Um, Especially when you look at again the Four Nations roster that just got named, right? You've got guys like, Brandon Hagel being named to the roster over players who are definitely a little bit more creative and we'll use the word skilled. So yeah, I think for that reason, the Seneca omission definitely did surprise me. I think the Yakemchuk, Parekh, and Seneca were the three big ones for me. There's obviously others. We could chat at length about that again, given the talent pool available, but those were the three that really stuck out to me.
There's this narrative that kind of comes up every year, and I'm just interested if you think there's any weight to it. I mean, taking a look back at last year, Canada kind of had a disappointing result. Is there a potential this year, and do you think it happened last year that some of the omissions, um, you know, is there potential that we could be talking about this at the end of the tournament again?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight's 50-50, right? If this team ends up playing well and captures gold, we won't be talking about that. But if they end up losing surprisingly in the quarterfinals because their power play goes 0 for 7, or because they're missing that physicality as a forward group, right? Then we're going to be talking about what guys like Seneca could have brought to the table, or what Zayne Parekh could have brought to the table, or Carter Yakemchuk could have brought to the table, right? Again, it's hard to say now, but it's going to be it's always a main talking point when Hockey Canada doesn't do well, because there are so many players to choose from, and there's so many different routes that they could take with the pool available.
Yeah, it's interesting. People are always kind of advocating for just taking the best talent available and kind of working with what you have. But if you're constructing a roster in the NHL or for any sort of tournament, I mean, that's almost never the approach you would take. Especially, I think every team at least has a role line or a couple of guys that are capable or of, you know, more specialist players, I would say. Like, so, yeah, I think you're dead on in saying it's either we're not going to talk about it at all or something happens and we're just going to keep talking about it till it gets tired. But moving on to your roster, you have Carter George starting in net. I think we're both in agreement that that's kind of a lock, at least going into the tournament.
Yeah, I think that he's so consistent, and I think that that consistency is always what Canada needs, right? They don't need to have the best netminder in the tournament. Obviously, it helps when you've got that, um, but you just need somebody who's going to be stable and is going to make the saves that they need to save, given the pressure that's on them. And Carter George has done well previously for Hockey Canada, and I think that he's somebody who's seen a ton of rubber over the last couple of years in Owen Sound. Um, he's well tested. And technically composed, and somebody that I think is going to bring that stability in net. I think that, in my opinion, he's just the best choice going into the tournament anyway.
I pulled this stat from the LA Kings website when I wrote an article on OHL players to watch this season. George actually faced more rubber than any goaltender across the four major North American junior leagues. So I'm interested. That's going to be a completely different environment than when he's playing for Canada, I would assume. So yeah, he's continued to face a lot of shots this year in Owen Sound, like upwards of 45, 50 a night. And he always gives them a chance. But do you think there's any difficulty to transitioning to an environment where he might have to be relied upon kind of cold, where he might get one or two big chances a game against, I don't know, Finland, Slovakia, but he's going to have to come up clutch?
Yeah, it definitely requires a different kind of mental toughness, right? You definitely have to be a very focused individual, and I think based on what I've seen, based on what I've heard other people talk about in terms of George's character, I think he's the kind of guy that can do that quite easily. And that's another reason why I think he's the choice going into this tournament.
So rounding out the rest of the goaltenders, you have Carson Bjarnason of the Brandon Wheat Kings and Jack Ivankovic of the Brampton Steelheads, omitting Scott Ratzlaff, who would be a returnee. So why do you see those two guys as the second and third goaltender here?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Obviously, Ratzlaff, is a returning, but I don't think he's been as good for. Well, we'll call it a. I don't know if they're a rebuilding Seattle team, but definitely not as strong as they have been previously. And I think he just hasn't been quite as solid this year. Whereas Bjarnason has been very good. Even Kovac has, he's been okay. The Steelheads have been a little bit underwhelming, but he's somebody who always steps up in big games and has big performances. We saw that at the Lincoln Gretzky Cup. So I think that his previous pedigree is going to put him in line for maybe that third role, where they're going to bring him for his experience so that he can sort of be that starter next year or the year after. I think it would be good for Canada to have a repeat goaltender that starts, not just, is a line along for the ride, but somebody who's starting multiple years, because it's been a while. I feel like since we've been fortunate enough to have that.
Before we move on to the rest of the roster, I just wanted to talk about the 2025 and 2026 NHL Draft eligibles. McKenna being eligible for the 2026 NHL Draft. Matthew Schaefer, Jack Ivankovic, and Porter Martone have made the camp and have made your roster.
Yeah, I think that. Well, with Schaefer, I just think that he's one of the best defensemen that the team has available to them. I think that you look at his work ethic as well. This is a player who is going to put in the work required to get better over the course of the tournament. We saw that at the U18s, where he played as an underager, and by the end of the tournament, I think he might have been Canada's best defenseman. And he's somebody who's consistently worn a letter for Hockey Canada, and I think he's ready. I think he can play a good, solid sort of third pairing role for Canada, and maybe even higher as the tournament goes on. And I think he's skilled and talented enough to do that. Porter Martone, I look at as, again, one of the few players on this roster, this camp roster, who brings that consistent element of physicality. I think that pairing him with somebody like Cole Baudouin could make sense in sort of that like shutdown checking line that Hockey Canada typically has, and he's obviously extremely skilled. So that's going to elevate the scoring ability of that line, and I think he's somebody that Hockey Canada could use in a multitude of different situations. So I think that definitely allows him to be more of a favorite than your typical draft eligible player. Obviously, he's a late birthday too, so that helps. He's a little bit older. Again, I mentioned even Kovac. I think he's just one of the better goaltenders available, and previous experience with Hockey Canada has been fantastic. So I think they're going to look at that. And And then obviously Gavin McKenna. I mean, he's Gavin McKenna. Like he's one of the best players in this CHL. And you'd be crazy, in my opinion, not to take him. Hockey Canada sometimes does some things that are questionable with underage players in terms of their ice time or even being named to rosters. Would it shock me at all if McKenna starts the tournament as a 13th forward where they bring him along slowly? No, it wouldn't. But I think he'll be on that roster. I think he'll be one of the team's main players by the end of the tournament because he's just that talented and that skilled.
I absolutely agree with you that all four of these guys should be there, and if they are, they will be there on merit. But I think it certainly helps with the amount of success they've had at previous levels for Hockey Canada. Do you think that's definitely something Hockey Canada factored in when making the decision for this roster?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something they always take into consideration, right? They want players who've had positive experiences in the program previously because they can use that to help players that be have shown rapid progression and don't have that experience. So regardless of age, Gavin McKenna's seen a lot in his young hockey career, and he can use those experiences to help him excel in a high pressure situation where he's going to be one of, if not the youngest players in the tournament if he makes that team, right? And those are the kinds of players that you want who have previous experiences to build off of. Because it helps take the pressure off of what's become such a huge event in Canada.
Andrew Cristall was arguably the biggest omission from Canada's roster last year, just based on the sheer amount of points he's producing. He's once again tearing up the WHL. You have him listed on your roster. I think a lot of other people do. Do you think it's the case that he played his way onto the team?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think he's a lock, and I don't think really too many of these forwards are locks. To be honest, I think that when you look at that camp roster, um, there are a lot of guys who I think are going to be fighting for spots pretty equally. And I think even some of the returnees, like I don't think Matthew Wood's spot is safe. I don't think Braden Yeager. I don't think his spot is safe. I think that the competition is going to be fierce. With Cristall, he's going to have to show that he can play with pace, right? That's sort of always been the knock with him. And when you're playing at the World Juniors, pace is always something that is extremely noticeable. The players who struggle are those sometimes who don't have that ability to play at an elite pace. He's obviously a very high end processor, so he's got to show at camp that his brain is going to be a massive factor for positive outcomes for that team, right? And he's a kind of guy that's going to be playing in a scoring line role too, right? Like this is not somebody that is going to be part of your checking line, like say like Cole Baudouin or Porter Motone, or Jet Luchenko or Denver Barkey, right? These are all guys that have a lot of versatility, and that is going to help them at this camp. But Andrew Cristall, if he's not playing an offensive role with other offensive players, Hockey Canada, might elect to go in a different route. I think he's on the team. I think his game has improved enough. He's been one of the best players in the WHL this year. I think his game has improved enough that he's going to be somebody that Hockey Canada is going to want on this roster, especially for the power play. I think he's going to be someone that definitely makes his team and is on one of the first two power play units.
I don't ever want to paint a broad brush across multiple players, but I'm interested in the profile of a guy like Cristall, maybe Jordan Dumais, where they're just scoring a lot of points. And there's, if they don't make the roster, there's always those tweets or posts or whatever saying like, oh, he has this many points. I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but do you know what I'm talking about? And just when it comes to these
Yeah,
kind of teams, what's the decision process like on guys like that?
yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Whenever people talk about these type of situations, I always think back to Daniel Cleary. I believe he was cut three times from Hockey Canada back in the day. Three different years. He was invited as a draft eligible, and then post draft, double post draft, cut three times. And I mean, that's got to hurt. But he was a player who did have some weaknesses in his game that were evident by the time he had hit his draft plus year two or draft year plus 2 year. And a lot of that had to do with pace and being a little bit more one dimensional. It wasn't until he really became a strong two-way player that his NHL career really took off with Detroit, where he became sort of part of that, we'll call it elite checking line that Detroit was employing over the years that they were extremely successful with the Chris Draper, Kurt Maltby, Daniel Cleary types that they were sort of churning out. And I think if he had been that kind of player when he was a junior player, he would have easily made that roster, right? But there's only so many spots for offensive types in these types of tournaments. And that's where these types of surprising cuts always come from, because there's just not enough ice time to go around for everybody. And you want players that are going to be able to excel with limited ice time. And those are your guys who are going to be able to get after it on the forecheck. Those are your strong two-way players. Those are your guys that bring some level of physicality, that bring other things to the table besides just offense. And that's sort of where your Dumais, Cristall types or your Daniel Cleary types sometimes can struggle to make these kinds of rosters.
Just want to take one look at your roster here, and could you just tell me how you think it could potentially shape up to previous iterations of Team Canada, as well as just the makeup of your roster and how you planned it strategically. I see you have Cole Baudouin, Jet Luchenko, Porter Martone. I imagine that's making up that line you're talking about that Team Canada usually likes to employ.
Yeah, I think that when I look at this camp roster, that one really kind of jumped out at me. I was like, okay, like those are three players who I would consider to be sort of the best candidates for that typical role that Hockey Canada always has. Like just looking at this camp roster, I don't see any way that Cole Baudouin is not on this roster, right? Like when we're looking at somebody who can play an elite penalty killing role, who has positional versatility, he can play center, he can play the wing, and the size, physicality component as well. It's like, okay, I think maybe they've already got their mind made up about Cole Baudouin, right? Like, there's just a few things that kind of jumped out. And that sort of seemed like a line to me that was fairly logical. Like, Jet Luchenko, obviously a strong two-way player, brings a ton of speed. Again, Porter Martone. I've seen a few people sort of suggest that Martone should be paired with Carson Raycroft, given their chemistry in Brampton this year. But I think that Raycroft is going to be better used in sort of like a first or second line role as a returnee. They're going to really lean on him offensively, especially from a goal scoring perspective. And he's another guy that can play the wing, play the center position. He's got some positional versatility as well. But I think there's something that you did want to talk about, Kyle, is the fact that center versus wing. How do you bring these players on? When I look at this camp roster, I actually see sort of more defined roles than usual. Normally, you see a lot more like sort of centers brought in, and it's like, okay, like which center is going to be shifting to the wing? Like who's making that move? Who's going to struggle to make that move? Whereas I look at this roster and I'm like, okay, like there are a lot of very clearly defined wingers on this roster. There are a few really clearly defined centers on this roster. And there are a few guys like Baudouin, like Raycroft, like even Denver Parkey, Luca Pinelli, that have some positional versatility. So it's, I would say, more than in previous inclinations of this roster. I see a lot more sort of like positional stability, and less sort of like worrying about who's moving where. Because sometimes they do just bring in like, of the 15 forwards they've got at camp, 11 are natural centers. And you're asking yourself like, okay, who's moving to the wing here? And like, how's that going to work? Whereas this year I do see a lot more thought going into potential line pairings already and roles already. I think that's definitely the case, more so than usual. So looking at my roster, I've got that clearly defined sort of checking line role, and then I've got sort of three scoring lines, and then a toss up as a 13th forward. Again, Brady Yeager, I just don't know if he's really he hasn't been terrific Um, I don't think they'll cut him, but I think he's somebody who sort of could maybe end up being the 13th forward if they can't find that role to really ignite him. But a guy I couldn't make up my mind because I have a hard time cutting a guy like Denver Barkey, who is just the type that would go through a wall for his team. And those are the kinds of guys who always find success at the World Juniors for Canada. You know, may not be the best NHL draft prospect, or sorry, the NHL prospect out there or on the team, but they're just such a solid junior player, and they're such a solid, well-rounded player, and the type that would just really excel in these types of short tournaments because they can just do so many things for the team. So I feel like he's the kind of guy that's going to come into that camp and just like really just put on a show and just be a buzzsaw out there and make the decision very difficult to cut him. So I had a hard time leaving him off my roster. And I know it's a bit of a cop out because I've listed two 13 forwards, which is it's not going to be the case. But I just didn't know who that last cut would be. On defense, I kind of see it. Uh, that's not to say that I don't think guys like Bo Akey and Cam Allen, Harrison Brunica have a chance. But I do think I'd be shocked if they don't roll with like a Dickinson Bonk pairing, just given their familiarity in London. Even though they don't play together right now in London, but there is that familiarity there. And one of these left shot guys, just based on, in my opinion, what I'm seeing on the camp roster. So some of these left shot guys are gonna have to play the right side. Because leading back to what I was saying about Yakemchuk being a snub, I just see a lot more strength in talent and ability on that left side. So somebody's going to have to make that move. I think Andrew Gibson is sort of a natural partner for Matthew Schaefer if you're going to bring Schaefer on. A veteran, defensive first, makes pretty sound decisions with the puck, brings physicality, can allow Schaefer to maybe make a mistake or two that he's bound to make at a tournament where he's playing as a significant underager. And I think if you're bringing Schaefer along, you've got to give him a partner like Gibson, who again plays that right side as well. So you're not asking somebody to play the offside with a guy like Schaefer, who's a little bit younger. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it all sort of comes together. That's just how I see things currently.
That being said, like Schaefer is a guy that I can see just being used anywhere. Like he's just so smart, and the skating just allows him, I think, to kind of thrive in any role, which also might have played a factor into his inclusion on this team. Um, and yeah, I agree with Gibson. I think he's a guy that maybe doesn't get a light shined on him a lot, but in terms of a guy on that third pairing, and like you're saying, playing alongside a guy like Schaefer, I think he could very easily be kind of an unheralded guy if this team goes on and sees success.
Yeah, and again, going back to the whole physicality thing, right? When I look at this camp roster, he's one of the players that stands out again, bringing that physical element, that shot blocking, that penalty killing ability, that shutdown defensive role that he can excel at. I look at the other defenders available; they're more of like the two-way types, and I'd be shocked if Hockey Canada doesn't bring somebody like that in the fold. Even if they use Gibson as a seventh defender and they're playing him on the PK and they're playing him to close out games and that's it. They always have somebody in that role, and he just seems like the most natural fit of the players that are coming. Kind of like what I said with Cole Baudouin. It's like I look at this camp roster, and I don't see a way, unless he has a very, very bad camp, where Andrew Gibson is not a part of this team.
With Sam Dickinson and the way he's playing right now, I mean, he's leading London in scoring. I'm not sure where he is in the OHL. I'm not sure where he is in the OHL leading scoring list, but he's up there. Do you see a possibility where he's kind of playing, upwards of 30, 35 minutes a night for Canada and London? Or do you think there's enough strength on that blue line that they're going to balance them out? Because with Sam, right now, I think he is risking a little bit of defense because London can afford to. But if he can kind of temper his game and find that balance, I think he might have I think of like a Thomas Chabot like performance, thinking back like 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's a great comparison. That's actually a comparison that was used a fair amount for Dickinson in his draft year. Um, I don't think he's going to end up playing like 30, 35 minutes a night. I think that this roster is balanced enough where we're going to see not evenly, rolling of the defensive pairings, but I think he's going to be tasked with maybe 23, 24 minutes. It all also it depends on who ends up playing on the power play one too, right? I mean, that's going to boost the ice time of whatever defender gets that role. And I think that's sort of up in the air. Again, I look at this roster and I see a lot of sort of power play triggermen, and good power play defenders, but not sort of that offensive catalyst. So, it kind of tells me that maybe Hockey Canada is thinking four forwards, and then having, Dickinson in sort of that triggerman role, or maybe they'd take the Dale Hunter playbook and they use Oliver Bonk in that bumper position, right? That's worked so well for London. So there's options available to them, and I don't think it's necessarily set in stone as to who plays that role, and that obviously is going to increase the ice time of somebody. It's likely to be Dickinson. I think he's the most likely candidate to be on power play one. But we'll see. Again, with his age, he's not as old as some of the other more experienced players on this roster, especially on defense. They might hold that against him and go with one of the older players to quarterback that power play. So we'll see. But I don't see him having to play 30 or 35 minutes a night. I think he's gonna have less of a workload than he sees in London on a weekly basis.
Moving on, the last thing I want to talk about today is just early looks at what the All-Star team could end up looking like. So I know you wanted to comment on some of the American guys.
Yeah, so I think heading into the tournament, I like the U.S. as my sort of favorite. I think U.S., Canada, and Sweden. We're not going to say every World Juniors, but in a lot of World Juniors lately, they've kind of been entering as the favorites, and I do like the U.S. coming in. So if I were to put together a sort of pre-tournament All-Star prediction, it's going to be U.S. heavy. I think Trey Austin has a chance to be the goaltender of the tournament. I look at Zeke William and him quarterbacking that power play. I think he's going to put up a ton of points. I think that gives him a chance to be somebody who's on that tournament all-star team. Obviously, I talked about Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault. I think they're going to put up a ton of points. They've got experience, a ton of experience internationally. They've had a great year with BC. I think that they're going to be really good at this tournament. And I just, like I said, I think if I were, again, filling out the rest of it, it's going to be North American heavy. I think Cal Ritchie's going to have a really good tournament for Canada. He's one of those guys that, like, when he plays internationally, he always seems to find his way to the top of the tournament scoring list. Even though he's not maybe the most dynamic player, and with his experience at the NHL level to start the year, I think he's gonna have a really good tournament for Canada. So I like him with the two American wingers to be part of that tournament All-Star team. On defense, after William, it could be Sam Dickinson. It could be somebody like Tom Willander. It could be somebody like ASP for Sweden. Constant Helenius for Finland, obviously with some pro experience, should have a decent tournament. If Edward Chalet plays for Czechia, again, he's got the pro experience now playing in the AHL this year. So there are going to be some high-end talented or high-end talent at this tournament. But if I were to pick a pre-tournament All-Star team, it would be very North American heavy at this time.
I think Zayne Parekh was defenseman of the tournament last year, so he was definitely a guy I was expecting you to say. I mean, he's been terrific in the
Yeah,
Swedish league
yeah.
this year, scoring at like one of the best rates we've ever seen.
Yeah, and again, he'd be right in that mix with William. I think that it'd be him or sort of Dickinson. I think those three definitely, in my opinion, would be sort of the pre-tournament favorites to be on that All-Star team.
Well, Brock, it's truly the most wonderful time of the year, not just because of the holidays, but for us hockey guys, the World Juniors. Thanks so much for joining. I always love talking to you and learning so much. I imagine we'll be talking again very soon as things start to heat up towards Boxing Day.
Yeah, absolutely, Kyle. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the McKeen's Hockey Show. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out mckeenshockey.com for all your World Juniors needs.